Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. A majority of Supreme Court justices appear ready to consider new limits on the right to an abortion, a case involving a Mississippi law banning nearly all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy, heard today. The court looking perhaps to revise the historic 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that legalized abortion throughout the United States, and then its 1992 ruling in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which reaffirmed Roe. The first case in the U.S. confirmed of the COVID-19 Omicron variant, a person in California. Authorities say that person was fully vaccinated against coronavirus. President Joe Biden asked about a report in a new book by Mark Meadows, former chief of staff to former President Donald Trump, saying that Trump tested positive for COVID-19 in 2020, right before a presidential debate. The latest on the ongoing confrontation between Republican Congresswoman Lauren Boebert and Democratic Congressman Ilhan Omar, and Vice President Kamala Harris chairing her first National Space Council meeting. That and more coming up on Washington Today. Sounds of rallies and protests outside the U.S. Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., as inside, justices hearing arguments in an abortion case, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. Capitol Police saying that officers arrested 33 protesters who were blocking traffic outside the Supreme Court despite repeated warnings. As for the case being argued, Axios reports the Supreme Court on Wednesday seemed likely to weaken abortion rights and perhaps to let states ban the procedure altogether. The court heard oral argument this morning over a Mississippi law that bans abortions after 15 weeks. Mississippi seemed likely to win one way or another. The court's main abortion precedents, Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, say that women have a right to an abortion until about the 24th week of pregnancy, when a fetus is considered viable. Chief Justice John Roberts and his conservative colleagues all question whether the viability line makes sense, indicating they're inclined to do away with that standard. That was the analysis from Axios. Here's part of the oral argument. Justice Samuel Alito, one of those conservatives, questioning Julie Rickleman, senior director with the Center for Reproductive Rights.
You do emphasize that the court drew the line at viability in Roe and reaffirmed that in Casey, and that is certainly something that we have to take very seriously into consideration. But suppose we were considering that question now for the first time. I'm sure you know the arguments about the viability line as well as I do, probably better than I do. What would you say in defense of that line? What would you say to the argument that has been made many times by people who are pro-choice and pro-life that the line really doesn't make any sense, that it is, as Justice Blackmun himself described it, arbitrary? If a woman wants to be free of the burdens of pregnancy, that interest does not disappear the moment the viability line is crossed. Isn't that right?
No, Your Honor. And if I may make a few points to answer your question. First, I think the state views viability as arbitrary because it completely discounts the woman's interest. But viability—
No, but does a woman have, upon reaching the point of viability, does not the woman have the same interest that she had before viability in being free of this pregnancy that she no longer wants to continue?
Viability is a principled line, Your Honor, because in ordering the
I'm trying to see whether it is a principled line.
Yes,
you agree with me, at least on that point, that a woman still has the same interest in terminating her pregnancy after the viability line has been crossed?
Yes, Your Honor, but the court balanced the interest, and in ordering the interest at stake—
look at the interest on the other side. The fetus has an interest in having a life, and that doesn't change, does it, from the point before viability to the point after viability?
In some people's view, it doesn't, Your Honor, but what the court said is that those philosophical differences couldn't be resolved in a way—
that's what I'm getting at. What is the philosophical argument, the secular philosophical argument for saying this is the appropriate line? There are those who say that the rights of personhood should be considered to have taken hold at a point when the fetus acquires certain independent characteristics. But viability is dependent on medical technology and medical practice. It has changed. It may continue to change.
Please.
No, Your Honor, it is principled because in ordering the interest at stake, the court had to set a line between conception and birth, and it logically looked at the fetus's ability to survive separately as a legal line because it's objectively verifiable and doesn't require the court to resolve the philosophical issues at stake.
Attorney Julie Rickleman, questioned by Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Arguing in defense of Mississippi's strict abortion law, the state's Attorney General Scott Stewart and Justice Sonia Sotomayor asked him about precedent and whether overturning it makes the court's decisions appear to be political and not grounded in the Constitution.
What hasn't been at issue in the last 30 years is the line that Casey drew of viability. There has been some difference of opinion with respect to undue burden, but the right of a woman to choose, the right to control her own body, has been clearly set for since Casey and never challenged. You want us to reject that line of viability and adopt something different. 15 justices over 50 years have, or I should say 30 since Casey, have reaffirmed that basic viability line. 4 have said no, 2 of them members of this court, but 15 justices have said yes, of varying political backgrounds. Now, the sponsors of this bill, the House bill in Mississippi, said we're doing it because we have new justices. The newest ban that Mississippi has put in place, the 6-week ban, the Senate sponsor said we're doing it because we have new justices on the Supreme Court. Will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? I don't see how it is possible. It's what Casey talked about when it talked about watershed decisions. Some of them, Brown versus Board of Education it mentioned, and this one, have such an entrenched set of expectations in our society that this is what the court decided, this is what we will follow, that we won't be able to survive if people believe that everything, including New York versus Sullivan, I could name any other set of rights, including the Second Amendment, by the way. There are many political people who believe the court erred in seeing this as a personal right as opposed to a militia right. If people actually believe that it's all political, how will we survive? How will the court survive?
Justice Sotomayor, I think the concern about appearing political makes it absolutely imperative that the court reach a decision well-grounded in the Constitution, in text, structure, history, and tradition, and that carefully goes through the stare decisis factors as we've laid out.
That.
No, it didn't, Your Honor,
Casey went
respectfully.
through every one of them. You think it did it wrong. That's your belief. But Casey did that.
Well,
and you haven't added
Your Honor.
much to the discussion in your papers as to the errors that Casey made, other than I disagree with them, Casey.
Justice Sotomayor, maybe I can highlight 2. Casey gave 1 paragraph to the workability of Roe. It then adopted the undue burden standard, which is perhaps the most unworkable standard in American law. It gave about 3 paragraphs, if memory serves, to reliance, which doesn't account for the last 30 years and the changes that have occurred since Casey. It gave a brief factual view to things that have changed since Roe. Those, of course, are not going to take account of the last 30 years of advancements in medicine, science, all of those things.
Mississippi Attorney General Scott Stewart and Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Bloomberg law legal reporter Jordan Rubin has been following this case, and he joins us now with more. Thanks for doing this. The headline on your article that previewed today's oral argument described the Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion as being on the ropes with this case that challenges Mississippi law banning almost all abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Now that you've heard the oral argument, what do you think?
I think in the first instance, it's very likely that at the very least, the Mississippi 15-week abortion ban is going to be upheld. Beyond that, it's unclear exactly what the court's opinion is going to be, but I don't think it would be surprising if the court formally overrules Roe and Casey or effectively overrules those cases.
So in the past, the court has figured out a way not to overturn precedent, but modify it. And you're saying that might happen now, but we're not sure what the final result will be.
That's right. So if you go back to Roe in 1973, which legalized abortion and set this viability line, there have been a series of cases since then that have effectively cut back or chipped away at that ruling. Most notably, 20 years later, in 92, we had the Casey decision, which upheld Roe's viability line, but reduced the burden on the state and imposed what's called an undue burden standard. So it kept Roe's viability line, but essentially watered down the right from Roe. And since then, there have been a series of cases that have dealt with case-by-case clinic restrictions and various restrictions that states have placed on abortion that have further reduced Roe. And so Roe has technically been on the books and Casey has technically been on the books, and those cases have been effectively watered down over the years. And so whether the court formally overrules those cases here or not in the Dobbs case, the result will certainly be that the abortion right will be further narrowed at the very least.
The court is often described as having 6 conservatives, 3 liberal justices. Did that play out as expected during today's oral argument?
I think it did pretty clearly. You have Chief Justice Roberts, who is, in a relative sense, on the left of the court, but that's only because of how conservative it is. And you have Roberts, who has most recently sided with some of the Democratic appointees. And so the conservative movement has been sort of skeptical of Roberts in these cases. But then with the appointment of Justices Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett after she replaced Justice Ginsburg, the right didn't have to worry about what Roberts would do on the abortion front. Even today, Roberts made clear that he might be ready to do away with this viability line and at the very least uphold the Mississippi ban. And the fact that he is the furthest to the left of the 6 Republican appointees shows how far abortion rights have dwindled over the years. And so whether there's going to be a 6-justice majority saying Roe is formally overruled, I don't know that we're going to see that, but it's certain that Mississippi is going to win the case, and it's quite possible that the court is going to formally overrule Roe and Casey, but it's also possible that the opinion won't necessarily say that the court is overruling Roe and Casey, but it will either effectively do that or it will effectively further narrow the abortion right that the court announced in Roe.
We're talking with Bloomberg law reporter Jordan Rubin. The clip that we played right before speaking with you had Justice Sotomayor talking about the political consequences of making all decisions seem political. And we've seen this recently where a number of justices have been concerned about public opinion of the court. How much weight do you think that'll carry in a final decision?
So I think it will carry 0 weight in the court's final decision. But I think what we heard today from Justice Sotomayor is speaking not necessarily just to her colleagues, but also to the broader audience who might be listening. I think that she sees the writing on the wall in terms of the composition of the court and where it's going, but she still wanted to get the message out of what she thought about what was happening. I don't think it was anything approaching a negotiation tactic with the justices, because it certainly wouldn't have any persuasive force with the majority, but I don't think that Justice Sotomayor thinks that there is any sort of navigable path to have any sort of compromise with the majority, at least not in this abortion case. So I think there was some exasperation there and a matter of just wanting to give her view of what she thought was happening in this case, regardless of what the ultimate result is going to be in this specific case.
In some of the cases that the view is that it's tough to reach a decision. The decision ends up being near the end of the term. Might we see it in this case that we don't get a decision until next June?
That's my expectation, that we are going to see a decision at the end of the term. That's just how these cases play out in terms of the most contentious decisions, because what's going to happen now is the justices will go back and start circulating drafts of opinions. And I think if nothing else is clear about this case, there's not going to be a single unanimous opinion, whatever it says. And so that means there are going to be dissents, concurrences, different opinions going back and forth. And so it's going to take a while to hammer out whatever the details of the opinions are going to be. And so that complexity combined with just the magnitude of the case, I think lends itself to the type of end of term decision that we've seen nearly every term. And this is certainly bearing the hallmarks of that type of case.
Jordan Rubin covers legal affairs for Bloomberg Law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After today's Supreme Court oral argument, one of the lawyers in the case, Julie Rickelman, senior director with the Center for Reproductive Rights, taking part in a news conference about the case. You'll also hear from the group's president, Nancy Northup.
From Jessica Glenza, there appeared to be a majority of Supreme Court justices interested in curbing abortion rights. How will the Center for Reproductive Rights do its work if the court significantly revises or overrules Roe v. Wade?
Julie, why don't you talk about that? Julie leads our litigation team at the Center for Reproductive Rights. So Julie can talk about this from a litigation perspective, and I'll give some thoughts from other legal fora.
Yes, so I think from the center's perspective, we will not stop trying to fight for women's ability to make this decision for their lives, their health, and their families. We think it is a fundamental right under the Constitution. And should the court decide that it's not a protected right under the Liberty Clause, we will continue to make every legal argument we can in the courts, including the federal courts, that this needs to be protected under the Constitution. In addition, of course, there are state courts and state statutes that can provide protection for people to be able to make this decision for themselves. And we'll continue to litigate in the state courts as we have for many years. So we will not stop fighting, because it is just too important for people and their families for them to be able to make this decision for themselves.
And I would add to that, of course, we work not just in the state and federal courts that Julie's talked about, but we also work in legislative advocacy, both at the state level and at the national level. And, Congress could fix the issue right now that we've faced in both this case and in the 6-week ban case in Texas and in the case from Louisiana in 2020 and the case from Texas in 2016. All of these bans and undue burdens on access to abortion care would be addressed by the Women's Health Protection Act. That would make sure that people can access abortion services without bans and unnecessary burdens. And it's already passed the House in September. It's strongly supported by the Biden administration. There's 48 co-sponsors in the Senate. So we will continue to be working for national protection of access to abortion care, not just the Women's Health Protection Act, but also the EACH Act, which would make sure that regardless of what insurance you're on, including programs like Medicaid or federal employee insurance, that you can have access to abortion care. So that's provided regardless of means. So we're going to continue to make sure that there is access across the nation.
Nancy Northup with the Center for Reproductive Rights. You also heard from Julie Rickelman with that group. A news conference today, and joining them, Sharon Brewer, Clinic Director for Jackson Women's Health Organization, which brought this case. You can find the full news conference at our website, cspan.org. It was a virtual news conference. You could also find the full oral argument of today's Supreme Court case. It's audio only, as provided by the court, as well at cspan.org. Now to coronavirus. A person in California is the first in the U.S. identified as being infected with the COVID-19 Omicron variant. Dr. Anthony Fauci, chief science advisor at the White House, telling reporters today it was just a matter of time before this variant, first discovered in South Africa and then popping up in a few dozen countries, would be found here.
As some of you may have heard, the California and San Francisco Departments of Public Health and the CDC have confirmed that a recent case of COVID-19 among an individual in California was caused by the Omicron variant. Genomic sequencing was conducted at the University of California at San Francisco, and the sequence was confirmed at the CDC as being consistent with the Omicron variant. So I know there are a lot of questions, but here's what we know right now. The individual was a traveler who returned from South Africa on November the 22nd and tested positive on November the 29th. The individual is self-quarantining, and all close contacts have been contacted, and all close contacts thus far have tested negative. The individual was fully vaccinated and experienced mild symptoms, which are improving at this point. So this is the first confirmed case of COVID-19 caused by the Omicron variant detected in the United States. And as all of you know, because we've been discussing this, we knew that it was just a matter of time before the first case of Omicron would be detected in the United States. And as you know, we know, I've been saying it, and my colleagues on the medical team and others have been saying it, we know what we need to do to protect people. Get vaccinated if you're not already vaccinated. Get boosted if you've been vaccinated for more than 6 months with an mRNA or 2 months with J&J. And all the other things we've been talking about getting your children vaccinated, masking in indoor congregate settings, etc. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna call on people. Go ahead, Deke.
Thanks, Dr. Fauci. At this point, should Americans be changing anything they do in their day-to-day lives? Are you changing what you do? Is the president changing what he does?
No, that's a good question and an obvious question. But if you look at the things that we have been recommending, they're just the same. And we want to keep doing that and make sure we pay close attention to that.
And are there other cases that the CDC is investigating as potential Omicron variants in the U.S. right now?
To my knowledge, at this point, no.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, part of the White House COVID-19 response team, today in the White House briefing room. Associated Press writes the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is taking steps to tighten U.S. testing rules for travelers from overseas, including requiring a test for all travelers within a day of boarding a flight to the U.S., regardless of vaccination status. It was also considering mandating post-arrival testing. Dr. Fauci also asked today about a claim in a new book by Mark Meadows, former chief of staff to former President Donald Trump, that Trump tested positive for COVID-19 on September 26, 2020, 3 days before the first presidential debate against Joe Biden. 5 days before he announced he and First Lady Melania Trump actually did have COVID. Again, here's Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci, there are reports that in a new book, former President Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, says that the then president, tested positive for COVID 3 days before the debate with President Biden. Were you aware of that positive test at the time? And do you think, given what Meadows says, that he put then candidate Biden at risk at that debate?
Well, I certainly was not aware of his test positivity or negativity.
You think he put President Biden?
I'm not going to specifically talk about who put who at risk, but I would say, as I've said, not only for an individual, but for everybody, that if you test positive, you should be quarantining yourself.
Dr. Fauci, just to follow on that quickly, if I may. President Trump's doctor, who you worked with at the time, Dr. Sean Conley, was aware of that, according to Mark Meadows, who you also worked with during that time. And yet, former President Trump continued to go out in public events. Based on your medical advice, is that something that you would have recommended if he had tested positive?
Well, I would recommend to anyone, whether it's the president or any of my patients or any of the people that I deal with, that if you test positive, you should be prudent and quarantine yourself.
Dr. Anthony Fauci at the White House with reporters. The report from Mark Meadows' book, titled Chief's Chief, first appearing in the Guardian newspaper this morning, Meadows writes that he told President Trump that day, Mr. President, I've got some bad news. You've tested positive for COVID-19. And Meadows summing up Trump's response, cleaning it up. Oh, spit, you've got to be trucking lidding me. Also, Trump, according to Meadows, took a second test that came back negative. It's unclear how much time passed between the two tests. President Biden asked about this today.
Mark Meadows has written a book revealing that President Trump tested positive for COVID 3 days before your first debate. Do you think the former president put you at risk?
I don't think about the former president.
Thank you.
That's President Joe Biden in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. A statement from former President Trump reads, "The story of me having COVID prior to or during the first debate is fake news. In fact, a test revealed that I did not have COVID prior to that debate." President Biden plans on Thursday to outline a strategy confronting COVID-19 this winter. Today, he talked about the economy, in particular supply chain delays and inflation. The president acknowledging that in the middle of the holiday season, there have been news reports about empty shelves, but that, as he puts it, for the vast majority of the country, that's not happening. The president discussing his meeting earlier this week with CEOs of some of the largest retailers in the country.
The CEOs I met with this week reported that their inventories are up, shelves are well stocked, and they're ready to meet the consumer demand for the holidays. The CEO of Etsy represents over 5 million small businesses and entrepreneurs. He told me, and I quote, "Our survey data says they are less concerned about supply chain challenges this year than they were last year," end of quote. I've also spoken with the CEOs of UPS and FedEx, which are on track to deliver more packages than ever. Now, I can't promise that every person will get every gift they want on time. Only Santa Claus can keep that promise. But there are items every year that sell out that are hard to find. Some of you moms and dads may remember Cabbage Patch Kids back in the 80s, or Beanie Babies in the 90s, or other toys that have run out at Christmas time in past years when there was no supply chain problem. But we're heading into a holiday season on very strong shape. It's not because of luck. We averted potential crisis by figuring out what needed to get fixed, and then we brought people together to do the hard work of fixing it.
As President Joe Biden in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, he also took reporters' questions about the supply chain and inflation.
President, thank you so much. There are a number of presidents, from Jimmy Carter to Richard Nixon, who really tried to impact inflation and supply chains and weren't able to largely do that. How confident are you that you have the tools and the power to do something about supply chains and help Americans find some relief?
Because of what I've seen so far based on what we've done. This is the first time I've seen where labor and business is so ready to cooperate. Because they didn't go through a period of over 2 years almost, of the impacts of a terrible virus that has caused real damage to the world economy. So I think people are in a different state of mind than they may have been during the Carter years as well as the Nixon years. It's just a different world.
President Biden in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, part of the White House complex. A story by MarketWatch, the Federal Reserve's plan to slow down and end its asset purchases should not disrupt financial markets, said Fed Chair Jerome Powell on Wednesday. The taper need not be a disrupted event in markets, Powell said during testimony to the House Financial Services panel, and he repeated that it was appropriate for the Fed to consider to accelerate the pace of tapering at its December meeting so that it wraps up a few months earlier. MarketWatch goes on, stocks which fell sharply after Powell's first opened the door to a faster pace of taper on Tuesday, rebounded in the morning session on Wednesday. Here's part of that House Financial Services Committee hearing with Fed Chair Powell, questioned by Anthony Gonzalez, Republican from Ohio.
I want to commend you for retiring the term transitory as it relates to inflation. My constituents have been complaining about it for over a year. Two concerns. One, inflation is particularly hard on low and middle income Americans, in particular those with fixed incomes. We all know that. It's been brutal for them. Two, and I think this is the new risk accumulates over time the longer rates are at zero, as anyone who invests money and discounts cash flows at a zero interest rate can justify virtually any investment. As we've seen that in various asset bubbles have built up over time. So now I think the risk shifts. Now I believe the risk is that we have let inflation run too hot for too long, and we're in need of a more sudden course correction, which you suggested yesterday. That being the case, what are you most concerned with when considering the ramifications of the taper on the market and the economy at large? What pockets of risk are you looking at as the taper begins?
Let me just say, I think that the taper need not be a disruptive event in markets. I don't expect that it will be. It hasn't been so far. We've telegraphed it. I mean, I think if you look at the state of the economy, look at where we are, look at the most recent run of data, you can see that the highly accommodative policy that we have, even after the taper is done, it's really appropriate that we taper. And as I mentioned yesterday,
I
in
agree,
my view, it's appropriate that we consider at the next meeting tapering faster so that it wraps up a few months earlier.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I would encourage you, and my concern again is we've seen asset bubbles accumulate over the course of the pandemic. Investors have done incredibly well. I think we should be tapering. I agree with Van in a lot of ways on the monetary front. But I suspect that there's risk building up, and I just want to make sure that it's on the Fed's radar.
Congressman Anthony Gonzalez and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, House Financial Services Committee. They were referring to the Tuesday's hearing, and that was the Senate Banking Committee. Powell joined again today by the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. More from the Market Watch article. At the moment, the Fed is slowing down its asset purchases at a $15 billion per month pace, which will end the $105 billion of ongoing purchases in June. Economists think the Fed will discuss doubling the pace of the taper to $30 billion per month, which would end the program in March. Completing asset purchases in the first quarter will give the Fed flexibility to raise interest rates next year, if necessary. That from Market Watch. On Wall Street today, the Dow falling 460 points, NASDAQ down 283, S&P down 53. Washington today continues in a minute.
At least 6 presidents recorded conversations while in office. Hear many of those conversations on C-SPAN's new podcast, Presidential Recordings.
Season 1 focuses on the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. You'll hear about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1964 presidential campaign, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the March on Selma, and the war in Vietnam. Not everyone knew they were being recorded.
Certainly, Johnson's secretaries knew because they were tasked with transcribing many of those conversations. In fact, they were the ones who made sure that the conversations were taped, as Johnson would signal to them through an open door between his office and theirs.
You'll also hear some blunt talk.
Jim.
Yes, sir.
I want a report of the number of people that signed to Kennedy the day he died, and the number signed to me now, and if mine are not less, I want them less right quick.
Yes, sir.
And if I can't ever go to the bathroom, I won't go. I promise you I won't go anywhere. I'll just stay right behind these black gates.
Presidential Recordings. Find it on the C-SPAN Now mobile app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. An AP story, Democratic Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is imploring House Republican leaders to do more to tamp down anti-Muslim hatred in their ranks. At a news conference Tuesday, she played a recording of a harrowing death threat recently left for her by voicemail. Omar, one of a handful of Muslim members of Congress, has been the subject of repeated attacks by conservative pundits and some Republicans in Congress. The most recent instance was precipitated by a comment from first-term Colorado Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, a conservative flamethrower who recently likened Omar to a bomb-carrying terrorist. That was from AP. C-SPAN carried that news conference Tuesday night with Congresswoman Omar and other Muslim members. Today, House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries asked about possible actions against Congresswoman Boebert.
So I know that you haven't yet committed on Representative Boebert to a specific measure. Congressman Bowman has called for Boebert to lose both of her committee assignments, though. I'm wondering what message you think that sends to some of your members if the Democratic caucus, given that the Republican caucus likely isn't going to act on this, doesn't take strong enough measures against Boebert.
Let's focus on the second part of your question. Why isn't the Republican conference going to act on this? What more does Kevin McCarthy need to see? I mean, what more does this guy really need to see? He's got Marjorie Taylor Greene completely out of control, Gosar out of control, Lauren Boebert out of control, Crossfire. He's trying to mediate the dispute, can't do anything, and we think this guy in this conference is going to solve problems on behalf of the American people. They can't. So, as Pete indicated, we're going to continue to focus on dealing with the challenges facing the American people. We're going to focus on crushing the virus, focus on creating an economy that works for everyday Americans, and making sure that we allow for opportunity in every single zip code by building back better. Now, as it relates to consequences for Lauren Boebert, certainly I think there are active discussions underway to make sure that Lauren Boebert is held accountable, particularly given the likelihood that we may not see any accountability coming from the four-ring malignant circus on the other side of the aisle. But hope springs eternal, and we'll see what emerges over the next day or two. At the same time, we're continuing to have discussions, leadership, House Democratic Caucus, to make sure that we support our colleague. Because clearly, this type of dangerous rhetoric is endangering Ilhan Omar. And it endangers other members of this Congress. And words matter. We saw the consequences of dangerous rhetoric on January 6th.
Can you say more about which options are on the table?
I'm not going to get out ahead of any discussions that we're having in terms of leadership and the caucus.
It's Congressman Hakeem Jeffries of New York. He chairs the House Democratic Caucus news conference today on Capitol Hill. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert was interviewed on Fox News Tuesday night. She was asked about her phone call. She made the phone call to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Reports were it did not go well. Omar putting out a statement after reading, instead of apologizing for her Islamophobic comments and fabricated lies, Representative Boebert refused to publicly acknowledge her hurtful and dangerous comments. She instead doubled down on her rhetoric, and I decided to end the unproductive call. Here's Congresswoman Boebert on Fox News last night.
I called to speak with her directly about me reflecting on my comments about her. I had made a public statement, but she didn't want to hear what I had to say. In her press release, really was like it was drafted before the phone call even had took place. Omar and the left don't want an apology. They want public humiliation. They want to cancel me, but that's not going to happen. Laura, I want to say this to you and the millions of Americans who watch this show. I will not be canceled. We all know why CNN and the left want to focus on these distractions. It's because they have no winning issues to talk about. Democrats can't talk about skyrocketing inflation or the invasion at our southern border. They can't talk about the Americans still stranded in Afghanistan. They can't talk about the supply chain shortages, workforce shortages, or gas shortages. Why can't they talk about these crises? Because they caused each and every one of them. Democrat policies have failed. One-party order for 1 year, and they are failing every single American. So they'll focus on Ilhan's outrage rather than the outrage of the American people who are suffocating under Biden's failed regime.
Congresswoman Lauren Boebert on Fox News Channel with Laura Ingraham Tuesday night. The Hill newspaper reports the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, Republican from California, on Wednesday pleaded with Republicans to stop attacking each other as they keep getting mired in nasty personal fights, admonishing them that Congress is not junior high. He is particularly referring to Congresswoman Boebert and another Republican Congresswoman, Nancy Mace of South Carolina. Vice President Kamala Harris chairs the Biden administration's first meeting of the National Space Council today, unveiling a U.S. space priorities framework. Harris telling the council members, who are senior members of the administration, the priorities will focus as much on Earth as outer space.
Today, our nation and our world is more active in space than ever before, with satellites in orbit that provide services and security to people here on Earth, with a thriving commercial enterprise, with the International Space Station among the brightest objects in our sky, and with the Artemis program, which is helping our nation achieve new heights. And while our exploration of space takes us up to the moon, to Mars, to the edge of our solar system, like the Apollo 8 crew, I believe we have a responsibility to also look to our home planet In this new era, we must see all the ways in which space can benefit Earth. We must see all the ways in which space can benefit the people of our nation and of all humanity. This perspective is central to our work as a council, because while exploration of space defined the 20th century, the opportunity of space must guide our work in the 21st.
Vice President Kamala Harris leading her first National Space Council meeting was held today in Washington at the U.S. Institute of Peace. National Space Council is part of the Executive Office of the President. It was first created in 1989 under President George H.W. Bush, but then disbanded 4 years later. It was revived in 2017 by President Donald Trump. Vice President Harris today also criticizing Russia for conducting an anti-satellite weapons test last month that caused shrapnel that endangered other satellites in space and astronauts on the International Space Station. They had to shelter inside. Harris calling the test an irresponsible act. Also on Russia, this from Stars and Stripes newspaper, the United States is prepared to impose severe costs on Russia, and NATO is ready to send more troops to the eastern flank if Moscow invades Ukraine, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Wednesday. Blinken, speaking in Latvia after high-level talks with NATO leaders, said Russia has sent tens of thousands of combat troops to the border and has stepped up an anti-Ukraine disinformation campaign that aims to destabilize the country from within.
We've made it clear to the Kremlin that we will respond resolutely, including with a range of high-impact economic measures that we've refrained from using in the past. Following my own meetings with President Zelensky and Foreign Minister Kuleba last month, other senior State Department officials have been engaging with Ukrainian partners, with NATO allies, and with the Russians. And I came here to Riga to consult and coordinate with our allies. And it is evident they are as resolute as we are. I heard that loud and clear in our discussions yesterday and today from virtually all NATO members and in direct consultations with France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. We are prepared to impose severe costs for further Russian aggression in Ukraine. NATO is prepared to reinforce its defenses on the eastern flank. My consultations will continue tomorrow at the OSCE Foreign Ministers meeting, where I'll also meet with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. The United States remains unwavering in our support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and committed to our security partnership with Ukraine. And just as we've been clear with Moscow, we're also urging Ukraine to continue to exercise restraint because, again, the Russian playbook is to claim provocation for something that they were planning to do all along. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this potential crisis. The most promising avenue for diplomacy is for Russia and Ukraine to return to dialogue in the context of the Minsk agreements, which aims to end the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Latvia for ministerial meetings today. He meets Thursday in Sweden with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And President Vladimir Putin, writes Associated Press, said Wednesday that Moscow would seek Western guarantees precluding any further NATO expansion and deployment of its weapons near his country's border, a stern demand that comes amid fears of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was from Associated Press. And finally, on Washington today, more holiday cheer. On Capitol Hill, lighting of the Christmas tree. The U.S. Capitol Christmas tree website says each year a different national forest selected to provide a tree to appear on the west lawn of the U.S. Capitol building for the holiday season. The 2021 tree comes from Six Rivers National Forest in California. And speaking at the ceremony short time ago, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California.
We're here to kick off the holiday season with the lighting, of this beautiful Capitol Christmas tree. Just to learn a little bit more about the tree, it's named Sugar Bear. It comes from the Six Rivers National Park, and that's in the northwest part of our state, California. It comes from over 4,000 feet in elevation. That's where it grew up. And Sugar Bear is 84 feet tall and only 19 feet wide. So it's tall and slim. I'd like very much to thank all of the California children who made the ornaments that make this tree look so special. Guess what? There are 15,000 ornaments on this tree. That's the most ever created by one state in the history of the Capitol Christmas tree. Would you give the children a big round of applause who made these ornaments, please? We're very proud of the number and the quality. California's forests, as Nancy Pelosi and other members here certainly know, face many challenges, most notably persistent drought and wildfires. I hope that this Congress and the Biden administration will really focus on those things and that we'll be able to do something about it. Because trees like this need water, and water has to come and they have to live. So I hope as we celebrate this Christmas season, we recognize that we must do everything we can to keep these beautiful trees, part of our heritage, alive, well, and thriving. Thank you, and Merry Christmas.
Senator Dianne Feinstein on Capitol Hill. After the ceremony speakers, there was the countdown and the lighting.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Michael! Yay!
U.S. Capitol Christmas tree lighting. At the White House tonight, there's also the lighting of the National Menorah, and you can find both ceremonies archived at our website at cspan.org. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. For more top Washington stories delivered to you each day, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word, at c-span.org/connect. Hope you have a good night.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day, we're taking your calls live, on the air, on the news of the day. And we'll discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Thursday morning, Russ Vought, president of the Center for Renewing America, talks about the debate over parents' role in education. Then Arizona Democratic Congressman Rubin discusses congressional news of the day and his memoir about serving with the U.S. Marines in Iraq, titled They Called Us Lucky, The Life and Afterlife of the Iraq War's Hardest Hit Unit. And Chad Berginnis of the Association of State Floodplain Managers on the proposed changes to the National Flood Insurance Program as Congress faces a December 3rd deadline to extend funding for the program. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Thursday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our new mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, text messages, and tweets.